Now we're going to go ahead and start writing the GL Studio related code that's specific towards handling the specific key or the specific mouse and keyboard events. Now that we have all of our data passed in, the first thing we're going to want to do is our little paranoid check. We want to see first, of course, if our component is valid. So we'll simply say if not g_p component. So if our component is for some reason null, then we can go ahead and return false, saying that the component is not initialized. After we do that, we're going to go ahead and store a display object. We have a display object pointer. We're going to go ahead and call this display object pointer handled object. A couple months ago, we talked about handling GL Studio events inside RSOs. Whenever an event is handled, not only does it return true or false, but in the case of the handle input method we're going to be calling here in a second, it will actually return a pointer to the actual object that handled the event. So if you wanted to do additional manipulation, or perhaps use that display object to find out specifically what was clicked, we can do so. So we'll go ahead and store this. We're going to go ahead and default it to null. And now we're going to start checking. We can either have a mouse or a keyboard event. So the first thing we'll do is check our event type. Is an event mouse, or is an event keyboard? We'll go ahead and handle these one at a time. However, you'll see that they're actually both very, very similar. We'll start with the event mouse. The first thing that we're going to do is actually create a mouse event object. This object is actually defined in the GL Studio header file events.h, and it will show you the entire layout of the event or the mouse event structure. We'll also be taking a look at it here because we're going to have to obviously populate the values in order to pass it out to our component. So we have our mouse event. We take a look at some of the different values we have here. The first thing we need to track is the event type, which in this case is event mouse. And then the subtype, which could be either mouse up, mouse down, mouse drag, or mouse move, was passed in, has event subtype. Moving on, we're going to need to go ahead and talk about our coordinates. Now, the way window coordinates work and the way OpenGL coordinates work are two different things. In Windows, the 0, 0, or the origin is actually stored at the top left of the window. However, in OpenGL, the origin is usually denoted at the bottom left. So we're going to need to actually make a quick adjustment to our coordinates so that the windowing system knows exactly where this event took place. Because the WinX and the WinY that we passed into this method are actually in window units and not necessarily the coordinate system for OpenGL. So we'll go ahead and do this. First, we know the X point is fine. It's at the left. It starts from the left and goes to the right. But the Y is going to be reversed. So we take our Y coordinate, and we're actually going to take our window height, which is a global parameter we created last month, and subtract that from the WinY passed in. So this will essentially flip it. Instead of starting from the top left, it's going to start now from the bottom left. For our Z coordinate, we're just going to go ahead and pass something non-zero. In the case of picking, it's not going to matter much because we'll simply draw a ray from the X and Y. And in 2D, of course, it doesn't matter at all. So just to be safe, we're going to make it non-zero. And the next thing we're going to do is actually record the mouse button pressed, as well as any modifiers. So we're going to check to see if our button, which remember is still a glut type, if the button happens to be a glut left button, then we're going to take our events button mask. We're going to set it equal to a mouse L button. And of course, we've already included the disty namespace. We don't need to do this in the future. We're going to be doing the same thing for the middle button and the right button. So we'll go ahead and copy this. We're going to say else if and else if the button is instead the glut middle button or the glut right button, we simply pass those values in instead. In this case, they're the disties mouse M button and the disties mouse R button. We also have a fallback. If for some reason the button is not a glut-defined type, we can simply pass it into GL Studio. Has a mouse button any. This is kind of our fail-safe. If we can't detect, if glut didn't tell us, or we can't detect exactly what button is pressed, we'll just say, okay, we're going to go ahead and handle any button. Alternatively, of course, you can just go ahead and throw away the event at this point. That's totally up to your design. Moving on, we have our modifiers. So we're going to start our modifiers at our none state, which is essentially 0. Now we're going to go ahead and check our key flags that were passed in. We're going to use some bitwise checking. If we have our key flags, if they bitwise AND with glut active shift, which means that the shift button is actively being held down, then we're going to go ahead and add that bit flag, or add the shift state bit flag to our actual modifiers. So our EV modifiers, we're going to go ahead and or equal the shift state, which is the disty defined type for holding down the shift key. We're going to go ahead and do this also for Control and Alt. And that's just going to be a quick copy and paste. So glut active Control, glut active Alt, corresponding to the Control state and the Alt state. So now we've populated everything that we're going to need to handle inside our GL Studio event. The last thing we're going to have to do is actually pass it into our component. We're going to go ahead and take our handle event. This can be the return value, and call our component's handle event method, or sorry, handle input method. This takes in a display event pointer. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and pass in an address to our mouse event. Mouse event is a display event. So we've done this. What this will do is actually run the particular event that we passed in through GL Studio's event handling system, and if it actually returns with a component that actually handled the event, that component will be returned to us here for any kind of future processing. In this case, all we're going to do is use the handled event and say, if we actually handled an event, we'll return true. Else, return false. So all we're doing here is we're just going to go ahead and get a little message, or get a little input back saying whether or not GL Studio actually handled this event. So that's how we handle our generic mouse events. Keyboard, like I said, is going to be very, very similar. We start out, instead of with a mouse event, we have a keyboard event. We're also going to call it EV. This time the event type is going to be event keyboard. And the event subtype, we don't actually store one for the keyboard. We know the keyboard button is being pressed. The button itself is passed into this integer right here called keysim. So keysim is going to correspond to the button that was actually pressed in the window. Everything we do as far as handling window coordinates is exactly the same way. So we're going to go ahead and pass in exactly the same here. And the modifiers are done exactly the same way as well. So we're just going to go ahead and copy those and paste those right in. So at this point, we've actually got everything we need for the keyboard event. Like I said, very similar to a mouse event. We have our actual keyboard event pointer, event type, event keyboard, subtype none. Keysim is the button that was pressed. We have our coordinates, and then any modifier keys that were pressed when the key was pressed. So at this point, once again, we can actually take our handle event and just pass it right in to G_P components handle input. And that is actually all we need to do inside this method. So let's go ahead and take a look, actually try to build and run our components, see if we made any typos along the way. And it looks like we did. Handled event is not a declared identifier. That's because I called it a handled object. Go ahead and this actually is an object, so we'll go ahead and make the correction down here. Now we'll build. It looks like we're good to go this time. We're going to go ahead and run the application. And we have our altimeter that we had last month. The only difference now is we can actually handle our mouse click, mouse drag, mouse move, mouse down, and mouse up events. Now you might be wondering about the keyboard events because by default this altimeter doesn't actually have keyboard events. I went ahead and hard-coded one in here. When you grab this demo, pressing the T key on this RSO will actually toggle the testing values on and off. So you can actually check to see yourself whether or not the actual testing parameters went in or whether or not the actual keyboard buttons are being handled properly. So that was a really quick and dirty introduction into handling mouse inputs or mouse and keyboard events in GeoStudio RSOs. As a quick recap, if you're doing this in Glut, the first thing we're going to have to do is actually write our event callbacks. We have callbacks for our mouse button, mouse drag, and mouse move, and for our keyboard, this is once again keyboard standard keys. Keyboard special keys have their own callback. Looking down at these callbacks, we start with the mouse button callback. We store the button that was pressed inside a global variable because the mouse drag and the mouse move do not handle it. We track the event subtype being mouse down or mouse up. The last modifiers we call glut get modifiers, and we also store this in a global because this method is not supposed to be called outside of this specific callback. However, we may want to know what modifiers are pressed for mouse dragging. We compile all this information, as well as the button that was pressed and the state, which was actually used to get this event subtype. We pass it into our component handle event method, which we just wrote. Mouse drag is done exactly the same way. The only difference is we use our global last modifiers button, and we pass in a mouse drag event as opposed to an event subtype because here we know that the mouse is being dragged. Mouse move, exactly the same way as the mouse drag, except for the subtype again is mouse move. The keyboard callback, exactly the same way once again as the mouse drag and mouse move. We grab the modifiers. This time we can grab the actual modifier keys. We can call this method inside of keyboard callback because this is a top-level callback just like the mouse button callback is. And then we call component handle event again, with event keyboard being the actual event, no sub-event, and key being the button that was pressed. Registering these callbacks is done inside the register CB function here. We have our mouse func, which is our mouse button, motion is mouse drag, passive motion mouse move, and keyboard is keyboard. The last thing we do is actually write our method, which simply takes this glut created event and converts it into either a mouse event, a disty mouse event, or a disty keyboard event. And then the rest is simply populating those particular events with our specific parameters needed to actually pass into our component to handle the event properly. So I hope this webinar was useful to you. Once again, this was directly picked up from our last month's webinar, so if you did not get a chance to view it or you haven't had a chance to download it from our support site, I highly recommend grabbing last month's Tech Tip webinar and starting with that one before beginning this webinar here. Otherwise, like I said, I hope this was useful. As always, a recording of this demo will be present, as well as all the source code, on our support site within a couple of days.